in the center? Yeah.
In progress.
Okay. So the only thing you missed online, welcome to those online, is a little bit of a review of how last time's topic, which feels like ages ago, it was over a month ago, leads into this time's, as well as where this time's end is going to lead into next time's beginning. That's basically it. Now for Hasidism versus the Mitnagdim, the opponents, the rocky emergence of Hasidism. After the Khmelnytsky pogroms, we saw one side of the coin last time. We saw the messianic fervor of Shabtai Tzvi. This time, we're going to see the other side of the coin, the emergence of something new. First, we have to understand what was. There were yeshivot where what was emphasized was Talmud study and pilpul, which I like calling ping-ponging with psukim. I've got this verse here from the prophet Malachi. I'm going to use this to prove this. Oh, wait, no, I've got something from Proverbs. And you take things which might seem like from left field in order to really get at an understanding, but you almost never have, this is what the law is. It's for the sake of intellectual debate and stimulation. Well, that hit the elites of Jewish society. But there was a whole group that was left out of that. Might not have been able to read. Definitely didn't have the background in Jewish text. And so how did they connect? Well, one of the ways in which they connected was through, shall I say, folk religion. You see, Israel ben Eliezer, born in 1700 in a town called Okap, what did he do? He, over time, became known as a Baal Shem. What is a Baal Shem? Or Baal Shem Tov? Yep. Master of the name, master of the good name. How do you become a master of a name? You make amulets or kmiot to ward off evil spirits or to heal people. There was a belief, and we could call it a folk belief now, but it was a strong belief that when people suffered afflictions, these amulets which contain God's name, as well as other special words, could heal them. And those who were good at creating these amulets and bringing about healing got the name Baal Shem Tov, the good name. They brought about healing. So he was only one Baal Shem. He got a lot of influence from Adam Baal Shem, a different person. He's Israel, is his name, Israel. But he got his influence from Adam. And what did they have in common? All these Baalei Shem, they employed magical techniques for manipulating the name or names of God from a Kabbalistic perspective. And this is really your book for Kabbalah. Again, it's on the shelf. God is a verb. They were able to use, and there are 70 names of God, just like 70 nations. They were able to use all these different names of God and manipulate them. And I said magic, and magic is a very loaded word. Because in Judaism, generally, as one of my teachers said, our magic good, their magic bad. I did a class on magic in Midrash. There's plenty of magical elements in the Talmud and beyond. And if they are done through, with the name of God in mind, and through what was the rabbinic tradition of the time, then it's a good thing, as opposed to necromancy or sorcery. That could be a whole class, but we're not going to go there, unless you want to with questions. Okay, so these amulets ward off the evil eye. We know today the Chamsa is one of these amulet-like things that we have. Or the red thread, different things to ward off evil. But what was interesting about the Baal Shem Tov, for short, the best, and I say he was the best of any of them, the best. What is interesting about him? He not only used amulets with names of God, but he introduced new interpretations of mystical thought and practice that eventually became the core teachings of Hasidic Judaism. Now, what is Hasidic Judaism? It's a little premature to go there, but the word Hasid means a follower, and it's generally someone who has an overabundance of chesed. We would have to go through the 10 sfirot or emanations of God to really go into that. This was not the first group called the Hasidim. There were Hasidei Ashkenaz as response to the Crusades who believed in afflicting themselves. And some of the early Hasidim, like Nachman of Bratslav, great-grandson of Baal Shem Tov, adopted their ascetic techniques or their forms of self-affliction, rolling around naked in the snow, food deprivation, sleep deprivation. But that's not the direction of the Hasidim we're talking about today. These Hasidim were people who, after Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, got a reputation, he attracted followers because they saw not only was he healing people, but he had these mystical techniques that he used. One of them was hit bodedut, comes popular with his grandson Nachman, where he goes off secluded and talks with God, and he comes out of the Carpathian Mountains and he says, all is good, everything is God. God's in everything. God's not just up here, that you can, transcendent, that you can try to get to through studying your page of Gemara. God's right here. God's within us. God is everything. That will become a problem in a minute. He also, some of this I already talked about, reprioritized Judaism as being prayer-centered. Why? Because the focus is dveikut, it's clinging to God. So he took not the Hasidei Ashkenaz who would do ascetic practice, but the practice of the Hasidim of the Talmud. There were these pious ones described who came an hour early to services to prepare, and they stayed late, and they moved around, and they had this passionate prayer. And he reinstated that was a focus, the energy in our connection with God and our ability to cling to God. Yes?
It occurs to me this is all very democratic. These are things that anyone can do, even someone who isn't literate and doesn't know how to read or write, even someone with few resources, they can still come early to prayer and be really intense about it.
Bingo. So we've got hitbodedu, contemplation with God, even in nature. We've got prayer in the synagogue. And we've got stories. I can't leave out the Hasidic tales. Stories with morals that appeal to the common person. Not things that take a rocket scientist or someone who has been trained since the age of 5 in Mishnah and the Gemara to figure out. Things which have simple moral lessons that can appeal to the masses. And one more thing I want to mention now. Early idea, said to be from the Baal Shem Tov's time. Again, he didn't publish any works. So that makes it tricky to know when exactly these things were. Avodah begashmiut. Holiness through corporeality. And I should have brought my water bottle, but I'll just, I'll tell you why. Luria, we didn't really talk because it wasn't part of this of Isaac Luria and Simsum. That Isaac Luria, am I on the screen, by the way? Isaac Luria had this belief God took up the whole world, God needed to make room for humanity, so God did Simsum. God constricted God's self. And in order to constrict God's self, there were all these shards of God that scattered, but they had holy sparks in them. And our goal is to raise up those sparks through our actions. So by me saying right now, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh bivaro, could have raised up a divine spark. According to this, anyone can do it. It's democratic. So we've got a few things that become threats that we can see where the ones who become known as the opponents from the ivory tower yeshivas are going to have issues. But we're not there yet. So the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760, and he'd moved from Okap to Polonia to Mezebuzh, different towns in depending on the time period, Poland, Ukraine. And his main follower was the Maggid of Mezrich, Dov Ber. What's a Maggid? A Maggid is a teller. Someone who tells tales or stories, or in my context, I want to say a preacher more so. Because people are trying to redo this Maggid role. I gave a sermon about the Dubno Maggid, who had nothing to do with this. There were Maggids. There were people who went to different towns and they preached and told these stories that connected to people. But what the Maggid's significance was he got people around a table. So Maggid is second generation. He's not the only second generation Hasid. There was Yaakov Yosef, who wrote one of the early sources on the Baal Shem Tov's work, Toldot Yaakov Yosef. And I have further down when exactly it was published. I believe in 1772, which is going to become a very important date. Because in 1772 is when the Maggid of Mezrich dies, 12 years after the Baal Shem Tov. But he assembled a group of followers, some of whom you might know their descendants. So one of his followers is a guy by the name of Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who was a more intellectual bent. Actually, there was a yeshiva student who became converted over. So Shneir Zalman of Liadi is known as the ultra rabbi of Chabad. I could go into the different groups' emphases, but I won't do it for this purpose. But Chabad is Chochma Bina Da'at. The 10 emanations of God all correspond to parts of the body. So they're very much focused on the intellectual, traditionally. But then you have then you have the Menor Emnaim, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Chernobyl. So we're in White Russia now. I mean, they're spreading throughout the region. It's not just one place, not just Poland, Ukraine, spread to White Russia. There's even spread into Lithuania, which is the centerpiece of the yeshivot. So what does the Meor Einayim do? He's more focused on the other aspects of humanity. He becomes the Twersky line that I had mentioned. The Bavaver line comes through him, the Satmar line, different lines come through him. And then Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev has a lot of teachings. And you've got Pinchatz of Koretz. You've got a lot of these different guys. I don't have time to go into all of them. But with the decentralization in 1772, the people in the yeshivot in Lithuania see an opportunity here. They say, we've got a problem. This is appealing to the masses, and it's also changing our focus. Where is the Torah and Talmud study? And we just had Shabtai Tzvi not too long before. The Frankists were still around. So he says, wow, we've got they say we've got a problem. They go to the greatest rabbi of the yeshivot, Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, a legend known as the Vilna Gaon, the Vilna genius, or the Gra. One who is famous for actually some more of these ascetic techniques, who slept 2 hours a day. He spent the rest of his day studying Torah. He had the minimum he needed to. Everything was about Torah. And by Torah, I mean Talmud. I mean rabbinic literature. And they go to him, this genius, who by the age of 9 knew the Talmud by heart. All those volumes over there. And they say, we've got a problem here. We've got this strange group of people. They're focusing on this idea that all is God. First of all, that's pantheism. That's even Judaism. Maybe like the Sabbateans. They're setting different hours for prayer. They're not being strict that you need to have the same hours. By the way, today, Chabad in many communities starts at 10, which is after the hour for Shema. It's not the focus is not. I mentioned Chabad because it's most relatable. They have a different method of shchita. Hasidic shchita actually is more strict in some ways, but they're not doing the nomian normative things. They're a problem. Yes, 1772. And the Vilna Gaon did not set out to oppose them. But he got a lot of pressure, and over time, he did. Now, I want to point out, there's less different between the Hasidim and the early opponents, the Vilna Gaon and his school. Chaim of Volozhin is his student, the Volozhin Yeshiva. There's less different about them than you would think. They're both Kabbalists in terms of believing the mystical beliefs. They both are innovators. If you go to Jerusalem, you might notice Shabbat begins earlier than it begins here. Because we do, when do we take in Shabbat? 18 minutes before, traditionally with candlelight. They do 40 minutes before. That's Minhag Hagra, the Vilna Gaon. He innovated that. So I don't want to present him as a curmudgeon who just did whatever was done before. No, he was an innovator. And he had his own halakhic rulings, some of which contradicted the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. But he does, over time, become an opponent. And how does he do it? 1772, the year the Magi dies, he issues the first cherem, excommunication of the Hasidim. He says these people don't represent Judaism, they're pantheists. They would later argue, no, we're not pantheists, we're panentheists. A key difference. Yes, Baal Shem Tov might have said God is everything, but it's really God is in everything. God is in everything is different than God is everything. There's a slight difference there. And he also says, look, these people are a little crazy. They had the Sabbatean fervor, where I mentioned he went into towns and won people over. Early Hasidim, and you'll still get glimpses of this sometimes on Simchat Torah, did somersaults during their prayer. They moved here and there. They did it. Their prayer was not I'm not saying he was a Yekka, Vilna Gaon, but it wasn't the straight, proper prayer that we're used to. That's a problem. And in this third generation, when it spread throughout all the way from Lithuania all the way further and further east deeper into Russia, by that time you had people like Noam Elimelech who prioritized a tzaddik. Now what's a tzaddik? A tzaddik is a righteous person, but it's an intervener between you and God. The tzaddik, I don't want to compare it to the bodhisattva, different religion, but the tzaddik is someone who takes on when God has bad decrees and can actually change the course of things.
Saints.
What?
It reminds one of the Christian saints.
Yeah.
One is not supposed to pray to them, but one prays that they intervene on your behalf for someone else.
Right. But that's a danger. That's a big danger. The reverence for these tzaddikim, and later what would become the rebbes or the teachers, to such a degree. You don't sit in the rebbe's chair. You don't do anything to oppose the rebbe. You go to this person, and they'll guide you. And they'll not only see you, they'll see within you what you need in that moment. They will advise you at that moment, and they will set you on the right course. Well, this is a big threat. The Vilna Gaon was the authority of the day. And to have all these decentralized leaders who are emissaries of God, who even can take on God and change your decree, we've got some problems here. 1781, 9 years later, another cherem decree is issued by the Vilna Gaon. But one thing I need to point out, cherem used to mean something. So, you sent me the book by Steve Nadler, my professor, who I study on Baruch Spinoza. So in the 1600s, if someone is kicked out, can't have any contact with them.
I haven't got to that part yet.
They lose, okay. Well, I'm saying what cherem traditionally meant. Forget him for a second. They lose all contact with their community. This is before the Enlightenment that we'll talk about next week. 2 weeks. They lose every contact. They're basically no place in your community. Well, to do that to an entire group of people is a problem. Because then the Hasidim start saying, okay, you know what? We're going to issue a cherem against you, the Mitnagdim, and it loses its purpose. Definitely by 1820, when we see the spread of the Haskalah, there's no purpose to cherem anymore. I'm not saying there's some people who ostracize individual people to this day for not giving a get, for being corrupt, for doing moral violations, but it loses its power because you've got two different groups fighting each other and issuing cherems against each other. But it gets worse. So there's a lot of tension. There are edicts, there are public speeches denouncing the other. But here's where it gets worse. Vilna Gaon only went to a certain degree. Because as I said, the Vilna Gaon was not looking to start a war against this group of people. 1797, he dies. And then the Hasidim are accused of subversive activities, like supporting the Ottoman Empire. And one of the reasons cherem used to have power is because you would do everything in a Jewish court system. So this is still the case in the ultra-Orthodox world. If I have a civil dispute, I'll take you to a Jewish court. Going to the Goyish court, that was a big problem. That was a no-no. But when they're accused of supporting the Ottoman Empire, and Shner Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad, who is one of the earliest books, Likutei Amarim, also called the Tanya, when they're accused of that, then it's a problem. Because Shner Zalman, the next year, is arrested and for treason by Russian authorities. He's imprisoned in St. Petersburg for 53 days. 2 years later, he's arrested again in 1800 with his son Moshe. And Shner Zalman was the one, I said it wrong. Liadi was Lithuania. He was the one who had the most direct contact. And he had before this gone to the Vilna Gaon to try to make peace, and the door was shut in his face. So he had more contact. That's why I highlight him. He's among the furthest west. So he has the most contact with the Mitnagdim. And then he leaves Liadi and he moves to, he leaves Lithuania, sorry. He was in Lithuania. I said it wrong. I know him as of Liadi. And then he moves to Liadi, which is in Belarus. And then his follower moves to Lubavitch. So they get into deeper into Russia. A couple things I want to add to this. Yes. Go ahead, ask the question. Because there's one thing I left out that I want to mention. Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about the competing bans that each side put on the other, the Kharam.
Yep.
What ground would the Hasidim use to put a Kharam on the Mitnagdim or on the Gra himself? I mean, don't you have to have some assertion of violation of Torah law? And what actual basis did they issue that? Not, you can't just do it because you don't like somebody.
So, I should have looked up one of their harems. I don't. It was mostly one-sided, if I recall, by the Misnagdim. I didn't mention 1796 was another. So 1772, 1781, 1796, because neglecting Torah study and heresy, emotional excess, interestingly, that was a prayer one. So heresy was that everything's God, emotional excess was a prayer practice, and neglecting Torah study. I learned in a class that the Hasidim issued against the Mitnagdim, but I don't remember what they issued, and it does seem, from what I've read, to be more one-sided. Yes, go ahead.
Is emotional excess dancing around?
Yeah, and somersaulting during prayer, yeah, absolutely. Hit lahavut, enthusiasm, which again could appeal, anyone could do this, could have hit lahavut. We have biblical characters who have hit lahavut. We see Saul with ecstasy. I mean, not the drug, but the action. So, by the way, I should have mentioned this. I have two sets of notes, and this was in the other one. There are two things I should mention. One, Baal Shem Tov had a simple beginning, which I think is why, and while he didn't set out to found a movement, Moshe Rasman makes that clear. Like most people, the disciples are the ones who really found it. His first job was a Baal Hefer. He was a teacher's assistant. And his second job was the shamus, a caretaker. So he himself was not from one of these elite families. And I think that made room for him to really base his way of life around more simple practices that were more democratic. The other thing I want to be sure to point out, so I mentioned that it was the opposite of asceticism. Don't be ashamed of pleasure or passion. In terms of his works, you do have to be really careful. If you read Shivchei Habesht, in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, hagiographic, 50 years after his death, this is published. And he's taking on all sorts of forces and doing all these things to reach God and bring people near to God. It's hard to find any reality in that. If you read its follower, Toldo Yaakov Yosef, or you read the work Sefer Harivash from 1780, you're more likely. They're closer to the time of his death, and they're less from a hagiographic perspective. So you're more likely to gain insights into what his teachings were. So, the other thing I want, want to mention is the Hasidim really had to prove that they were not like the Sabbateans, that they were not antinomian. And Moshe Rossman indicates, no, this is a modification of certain conventions in Judaism and reprioritizing them. It's not about let's go and do something new. But because that was what was proposed earlier, that was a danger. So this Hasidic idea of Yirida l'sorach aliyah doesn't mean I'm going to descend through doing sins in order to raise myself up. It means life is a roller coaster, and you're going to be at points where you're down, and maybe this point where you're down, or you feel further from God, is to help raise you up later on. So it's a different understanding. I want to finish with one thing, and then I want to take some questions. So, the last real example of someone in prison, I just reread Art Green's Tormented Master and Nachman of Bratslav, which I'm happy to lend out. The last real example was when Shneir Zalman was arrested in 1800. There was still some infighting after that, but definitely by 1820, the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim joined forces. Why? They had a common enemy, the Maskilim, those proponents of the Enlightenment who left traditional Judaism to integrate into the world. And the goal becomes Keruv over time, save Jewish souls who are straying away. And that's when the dress really becomes ossified. That's why we have dress from that many wear from 1700s Europe, because you start to see in the early 1800s, and we'll start with Mendelssohn next week, which is in 2 weeks, which is earlier than that, 1700s. But you start to see people changing their dress, changing their name, going to universities, abandoning any outward sign that they are Jewish. And that becomes a greater threat than these differences, whether or not I'm going to focus on prayer or study or do it at the right time, or how I'm going to slaughter an animal, or whether I talk about God as a center or I get to God through study of Talmud and what really wants. Those things become so minor in the focus of a greater enemy, a greater danger of assimilation and loss of Jews, that the divide really goes away. And after this third generation, I think that's why, the generation of Shneir Zalman of Liadi and Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, after that generation, Hasidism becomes more ossified. So the people who are into neo-Hasidism and renewal generally point out Hasidic teachings from the first 3 generations and stop after that. Because after that, you get to more of the, you get not just a movement more to the right, but you get a movement of more of the restrictions and less of the innovations in terms of the thought of the writers. Questions?
What was the... At the time of the Baal Shem Tov, what was the degree of illiteracy among the Jews in Eastern Europe, and how did the opponents of Hasidism deal with people who they knew would be illiterate?
I'm glad you asked that. So, the democratization of education, and correct me if you have a different understanding, really doesn't hit Eastern Europe till the 1800s. I mean, Russia doesn't redeem its serfs. It's still kind of in a semi-feudal society until 1848. That's why things start in the 1700s in Western Europe, and they gradually move east. So at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, who lived, and I just saw here, I want to be sure I get it right. So the town Okop is on what is today the Polish-Russian border. The literacy rate, and I don't have exact statistics, but it would not have been very high in that society. So you're seeing where those who had, and the greatest pride of the traditional Jewish community, which was the dominant Jewish community, because Jews lived in shtetls, largely by choice. You're right, at the Venice ghetto hundreds of years before that, but generally by choice. Pale of Settlement comes up a little after the Baal Shem Tov as a really big force with Catherine the Great. But you don't have that high illiteracy rate, which is also why I think this appealed more to the masses.
So how did the yeshivot deal with the illiterate people who didn't study Talmud?
My best understanding of that, Am Haaretz, people who are ignorant. And keep in mind, we're living in a society, I didn't talk about this, but the language is Yiddish that is spoken. Hebrew is only reserved for the synagogue, for prayer. It's not a spoken language at this time. We have, yes, we have the study of Talmud, a work in Aramaic, which is a language also not used during this time. So you don't really have much. You don't have works that are being published in the language that people speak at the time.
There's oral instruction.
Yes, oral. Well, yeah, the Torah is oral Torah, so that I imagine was more of the focus. Yes, you have the printing press and you could print books, but more of the focus was Rebbe to disciple or chavruta to one another. It wasn't a focus on being able to read the text. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Nathan has a question.
This is just, yes.
And then if Zoom, anyone has a question, I'm sorry if I ignored those on Zoom. Sometimes I walk around and...
Couple of questions. The first was this sort of détente you mentioned between the Misnagdim and the Hasidim, in which they kind of joined forces to oppose modernity, secular Judaism and kind of the emergence of reform, or simply just assimilation. When exactly does that happen? Or generally does that happen? And the other one is, if I recall correctly, there was a major controversy in 19th century Judaism over printing Sidurim. Over introducing actually printed sidurs as opposed to simply people having memorized the prayers. And how did that play at all into, am I misremembering, or did that play at all into the Hasidic and Misnagid controversy?
Okay. Let's start with first. Remind me, because I got into this.
When did the Misnagdim and the Haredim have their sort of détente to oppose the Maskilim?
The general date I've seen is around 1820, maybe 1810, but because the Enlightenment is spreading west. It already had been for about 100 years in Western Europe, but things are starting to spread. So I'm going to see, I have to look that up on the controversy, because it also says you shouldn't be doing it by heart. That's another part of praying. That even if you know it by heart, you should use a siddur, so I don't know enough of the history of how the siddur became mass published. Certainly it is in the 20th century, but in the 19th century, I don't know.
Okay, I thought it was one of the controversies that Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was involved in was that he was in favor of printing Siddurim, and a lot of Orthodox Jews said this is too much like Christianity, where they read from prayer books. But this area of history is not my expertise, so
So
I can
here's
hear
an
you
interesting thing that you said, that you just said about that. I'm going to stop looking for a second. When we're talking about the Hasidim or the Mitnagdim, we're talking about the ultra-Orthodox. And it's important to remember, modern Orthodox, the forebearers of Knesset Israel, was an innovation as well in Western Europe, in Germany, by Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in the 1700s, because universities have become open. So go to university, get a job in the world. Torah, but still keep Torah. Torah in Derech Eretz, and combining the two. And I don't know if this is a tangent, but I'll just say it. One of the challenges I was just talking about, I think Rabbi Silberstein about, Rabbi Garth, is that there's a challenge because modern Orthodox has become the most expensive of any of the movements by far. Why? Because in addition to needing the private Jewish education, you need to have secular studies there, which is an extra expense because you're going to want teachers who are certified or at least knowledgeable in secular studies. You're going to want your kids to go to day school throughout. You're going to want them to go to summer camp, and you're going to want them to go to university. So all those things combined make it very, very challenging. Trying to have the best of both worlds is always a challenge. Yeah. But I'll look into that. I haven't heard of that controversy by Hirsch. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I've taught about the formation of modern Orthodox Judaism, but it probably, but there were things that Hirsch had resistance against in modern Orthodoxy because people felt that they were too goyish. I mean, because even Hirsch was good with giving the sermon in the vernacular, in German. How can you do that? You have to do Yiddish. So he did have resistance. That particular one I'm not familiar with. But I'm going to look into it now. I'm really glad that you brought it up. And it makes sense to me why people would think that.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Tab.
Welcome back to
We're glad to have you from Arizona. Tab was taking care of a friend, and we're so glad that he's back.
Yes. You mentioned different factions of Judaism is explaining things.
Yeah.
People have questions. And you mentioned more than once that it could create a problem with the answers. Could we wrestle with the answers, I guess? What is it? What do we mean by a problem? If it in getting the answers, I want to understand what it means to get the problem. Is it the problem with what the answer, or is the problem is how we going to absorb the answer and what we do with the answer?
I'm trying to remember the specific reference because I want to be sure I answer your question correctly.
What I was thinking is that it made me think about what Moses was asking God. He wanted to see his face. And he couldn't see his face because it said a man cannot see God and live.
Mm-hmm.
But then another place it says, the people that are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face. So does that say that the individual man could not see God's face, but a people can see God's face? Then getting these questions from all these different factions could be very important and productive for us because it would enable us to see God in a more broader perspective.
So
Does that make any sense?
yeah, it did. I think that what's going on here, though, I think it's. I don't think I was trying to imply that you shouldn't ask questions. I think if I'm giving an honest critique of myself, because I was trying to show where the Mitnagim's opposition would have come from with the Sabbatian movement, I think that part of it certainly was, from what I've seen, that Hasidism was a threat. Whenever you have a populist movement, it threatens the status quo. And so, therefore, there's a desire to squash it whenever you have it. Because those who have, like last time, Jacob Sesportus represented the status quo. And Shabtai Tzvi did himself by converting to Islam, even though his followers continued into the 1700s. But when you have the desire to, I don't think it's asking questions as much as it is innovating or reprioritizing practices. Or let me look at it this way. So having a lot of ideas, because I've had a lot of ideas in synagogues I've been in, and you can't push forward an idea that the community is not ready for. You can push, you can encourage, and you can set seeds, but you can't go where it doesn't work for the community. And the Hasidim, through some of the examples I showed, went in a place that didn't work for the normative Jewish community of that day. And that's when you get yourself into trouble. So I don't think it's asking questions as much as it is making innovations that threaten what is. And you can think of it in modern circumstances, that anyone can say, oh, we want change, but people really are embedded in a status quo. And when you push against it too hard, there are consequences for doing so.
So is that wrestling?
Yeah, there was wrestling here. There was definite wrestling here. But you both have given me two good questions that I'm going to leave here with and look into, and I'm going to try to reply to both of you. Dwight gave me the question, what was an example of an excommunication of the Hasidim against the Mitnagdim? And Nathan gave me this controversy with Hirsch trying to mass produce Sidurim. So the two of you I will reply to after. I'll see you in 2 weeks. I want to thank Joanne for opening. I want to thank David, who had the wrong time and came in last minute. That's why we had a few delays. I hope you could hear us on Zoom. I want to thank you. And, of course, I want to thank KOH Library and Cultural Center. And Joanne and Dwight for these wonderful refreshments. And I'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, if not before.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Excellent. Phew.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
yeah, yeah.
I believe I saw up to 10 people at one point. Yes.